and welcome to my channel. My name's Whitney and I like to tell strange stories from my home state of Kentucky. Today's strange story is it's a pretty crazy legend. It is the story of Octavia Hatcher of Pikeville, Kentucky that was supposedly buried twice. So let's get on with the story. So Octavia was born May 21st, 1870, and as far as her life growing up, her family was very successful and well respected. Her father had owned a dry goods store and he was one of the original founders of Pikeville. When she was 19 years old, she met James Hatcher. He was 30 years old. It was the year 1889, and later that year, in December 18th, they got married. A little over a year later, on January 4th, 1891, Octavia gave birth to their very first child. It was a boy, and they had named him Jacob after Octavia's father. Unfortunately, after only a few hours, baby Jacob passed away. This was so devastating to Octavia that she fell into this deep depression for months. Later in April that year, she had fallen very ill and became bedridden. Soon after becoming bedridden, she fell into a coma and eventually passed on May 2nd of that year. She was declared deceased. I couldn't imagine how her husband James had felt to first lose their son and watch his wife go downhill and die too. It was just terrible. And yeah, so they declared her death on May 2nd, 1891. It was an unusually hot spring, and so they didn't embalm her. So they had to hurry up and have her a funeral and then bury her. So a few days later, after burying Octavia, James had noticed that a lot of people in the town were falling ill. They would get really sick and go into a comatose state for days and sometimes weeks, and eventually wake up and recover. It was some sort of sleeping sickness that was brought on by an insect bite. James, he was really worried and wondered, did he bury his wife alive? So he asked if he could have his wife exhumed so he could investigate to maybe see if there were any signs that he had buried Octavia alive. So I do want to say that James's fear of maybe burying his wife prematurely is a very understandable fear, because back then it was something that happened, that they didn't have good technologies like they do these days, and often when someone would pass, they would kind of put a mirror up to their mouth, and if it fogged up, they were alive. If it didn't, they were dead. And someone's heartbeat could be so faint that you really couldn't tell if they were alive. And with rushing to have his wife buried so fast and everything, I could see how it could be looked over. So James did in fact go with his gut feeling and have her body exhumed. They opened the coffin, and his worst fears and nightmare had come reality, and she had this horrible look on her face of fear, and her fingernails were broken and bloody, and inside the casket there was this satin lining, and it was torn, and there were scratches on the inside of the coffin. He was so heartbroken. He reburied the body and erected this life-size monument that looked exactly like Octavia, and the baby was at the foot of her monument. Locals say that she haunts the cemetery and you could hear her cries. And on the anniversary of her death, or on Halloween, her monument actually turns and spins facing the opposite direction of the city on the people who turn their backs on her. So the truth to the story is, this is no truth. The craziest part is there are no articles and newspapers at that time that suggest that she was buried alive. In fact, she doesn't even have an obituary, which is pretty strange. I mean, her family was founders of Pikeville, and her husband James was a very prominent businessman, very wealthy, and why wouldn't she have an obituary? Well, Jamie Rubio, I found a blog, actually looked into this whole ordeal, and Octavia was an actual woman who lost her child, who got sick. They don't know what she actually died from. It's unsolved and inconclusive. And James did erect this monument, but there is no truth that suggests that her body was exhumed, that there was an illness in the town that they believed that she could have died from. And as far as the hauntings go, it is near a college, and a lot of the college kids would go into the cemetery and drink, and vandals actually got to her statue, and she's now missing an arm. They had to build a fence around her monument so that vandals would stop damaging her monument, which is absolutely horrible. So as far as how this legend might have gotten started, James had built the Hatcher Hotel, and he had a museum inside the hotel and had many things on display, and one of the strange things on display was a coffin which had a escape hatch on it. And they believe that this legend could have gotten started because he had that. He could have had this big fear of getting buried alive, and that his wife had died young, and that was probably what happened to her. So, I mean, could have she been buried prematurely due to an illness in the town? Not likely, but maybe. Maybe it could have been a big cover-up, and that's why there's no obituary or newspaper articles on it, because she was so prominent in the town, they didn't want this to get out. Who knows the real story? I guess we'll never know. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I wanted to share it with you guys. And I want to thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you enjoyed this story, if you've ever heard of it before. I hadn't heard about it until tonight. Anyways, I love you guys so much, and I will catch you very soon. Bye.